In this very short module, we want to talk also about the serverless services. And to understand what serverless means and where this is coming from, why there is a need for that, let's have a look at the following evolution of services. In the beginning, there were of course the on-premise data centers. But the problem with that was, of course, the company had to worry about what is the right hardware. What type of hardware we need, where can we get this from, how can we also ensure the security so nobody breaks into our data center. And of course, this was very expensive and it was sometimes hard to increase the amount of hardware that is needed. And sometimes if they don't need it anymore, how do they really justify these investments? And the solution to this was the cloud offering of infrastructure as a service. So like this, now the physical security is taken care of. Nobody had to worry about the hardware and the scalability anymore. But again, there were some problems because now the company was still responsible for all of the software, for all of the operating system. They had to make sure that all of the security patches are installed and everything had to be monitored. So this can still be sometimes complicated and they cannot focus on their main business. And therefore, the next evolution step was platform as a service. Now the operating system is taken care of, all of the security patches, everything in the background is now taken care of. But still, it was a little bit tricky sometimes because now it was the company's responsibility still to make sure the right computing power is chosen. So the right size of compute power is chosen, because sometimes we then pay for something that we don't even need. And even though there are some of the auto-scaling features available, we still usually have to define how this should scale up and how this should scale down. And this is sometimes nothing we want to worry about because maybe we just want to focus on the code itself. And therefore, the last step of the evolution, the serverless services evolved. So in this type of service, we don't even see the servers. This doesn't mean that they don't exist, but they are just completely invisible to us. And we as a company can now completely focus only on the code itself. And therefore, let's have a closer look now at this type of service that is a little bit specific. As mentioned, the server is still there. There is of course still some physical server available, but we don't see it as users. That's why it's called serverless. We can now completely focus on the code. And about scaling, we now don't worry at all. We don't have to make any setup there. No configuration is needed. We only focus on the code. Of course, this is not the right solution for all types of code, for all types of services we are developing, but usually this focuses on some smaller microservices. These are usually some kind of event-driven codes where we have some kind of event or some kind of triggers that trigger the execution of the code. Maybe some HTTPS request is a trigger, this is some kind of event, and then the code snippet, some small snippet of code is being executed. And the great thing is we don't have to worry about how much size we need, because now everything is managed in the background. If we have a lot of users suddenly coming in, this is all fine. This is automatically handled. And we just pay usually per execution or per time. This is also referred to as micro-billing. Because if the code is not being executed, we pay nothing at all. So we pay just, for example, per execution, maybe per 1000 executions, we have a certain price. And if this is not being used, we don't pay anything. But if there are a lot of users suddenly coming in, we also don't worry about that at all. That is all handled and we just pay per execution or maybe per compute time that is needed. So this is the serverless service types. And now in the next lecture with this background knowledge, we want to now dive a little bit deeper and have a closer look at the services that are available in Azure. Let's talk about the first type of service, that is Azure Functions. As this is part of serverless compute, it is also true for Azure Functions that all of the infrastructure is completely managed and we don't worry about all of the infrastructure, all of the platform. The scaling is also completely automated. So what are Azure Functions? Azure Functions execute just a code snippet based on some event. So this can be then triggered and we don't worry about the platform, about the infrastructure. We only focus on this code. And this code is the basic building block of Azure Functions. We provide this, and this code snippet is called a function in the Azure Functions service. So that's what we are doing. We focus on the code. And these kind of code snippets, as mentioned, are called functions. So these are usually some very basic functions. They are triggered by some kind of event. For example, it can be an HTTPS request. And then again, we only pay for the amount of time that is needed to execute this function. These Azure Functions can be stateful or stateless. Stateful means that they remember the past state. So for example, if there's some kind of result, this can be stored, for example, in a variable, and then we can use that later on. But this function can also be stateless. That means whenever the function is executed, they have no memory, there's nothing saved, and they will just start at 0. Some of the use cases are that we can, for example, process some files. So whenever in a storage account there's a new file uploaded or changed, there can be some kind of very small workflow by using some code that is then just run when this is happening. Another option is that we can also schedule some executions of code to just execute some smaller tasks. It is important that this usually is triggered by some kind of event or schedule. So like this, we can build microservices that are based on some kind of events. We can use many programming languages, for example, Python, Java. This is all possible, so we are not bound to one language only. These are Azure Functions that we can use to execute code in the cloud that are usually based on some kind of events or triggers. Let's now also have a look at how we can create a function in the Azure portal. To do this, we can search for the service function and we find function app. That's the service we want to select. Of course, currently there are no functions created yet, but we can do this again by going to create, and there we can configure our function app. What we want to do is create a resource group. This will just help us to then afterwards delete the entire function app with all of its components. So we can use the name function resource group, and then we can click on OK to create this resource group. And now we have to provide a function name. In our case, we could call this just visitor. We can see if this is working. This is not available, so we could use, for example, my visitor, and we can see this is working. If it is not working, you can just add a number. This is completely fine. And then we can use as publish code because we don't want to use any Docker container. Afterwards, we can select as runtime stack, in our case, for example, just .NET. We don't need to make any changes in these default settings. So we can leave the version, and also the region is fine in our case. Same with the operating system. The plan type is now important because this is dictating whether we use it as a serverless feature or not. So if we select serverless, of course, then we don't pay when this is not used. We only pay when it is used, and the auto scaling is without any configuration. So this is really powerful, and that's what we want to use in our case. Now we don't want to make any changes in hosting and all of the other configurations. We can just go to review and create. Then this should be good. The validation has been passed, and we can just create this function app. And then after a minute or so, the deployment is completed. Let's go to this resource. We can see this is our function app. Currently it is running, and we can also already see this is our URL. But now this function app does not contain any function yet. This is what we can add in the next step. Therefore, let's go to the function section where we have the option function. Of course, now there are no functions yet, but we can now also create a new function. And then we can choose, in our case, to develop this function in the portal. So we don't need to develop it in some other tool. We can just directly develop it in the portal. And we even have some templates available. For example, some time trigger or also an HTTP trigger. Like this, we can create a function that just is executed whenever this HTTP request is received, and then the response is how we define it in the function. That's what we want to select. And then if we have this selected, we have the function name and the authorization level. We can, in our case, also change to anonymous, just so that we have it easier to run and execute this function. And like this, we can test it a lot easier. Therefore, let's now create this function. We can see this function has now the status enabled, and we have some code that can be executed. So if we go to this code, of course, don't worry, this code you don't need to understand. This is way beyond the scope of this lecture, but this is just what this function is doing. So basically, we get a name that will be returned in this text. So there's a message that will be returned when this function is triggered, and we can also add some parameters like the name, for example. If we want to test this, we can go to test in here and now also quickly run the function to see if everything works as expected and we get the output that we are expecting. So in this case, we used the name Azure because we have provided that in here. And if we want, we can even add additional parameters into this function. To do this, we need to modify the HTTP trigger because this now basically acts like an API. And the trigger we need to modify so that this additional parameter in the URL can also be accepted. To do this, we go to integration where we see we have our trigger, we can add some inputs, modify the output and so on. But we will just add in the trigger the route template. So this is just a relative path like in an API. We can, for example, add visitor and then we can add a parameter name. This will then be replaced by the value that we are adding in the URL. So for example, a name, and we can use the parameter name, visitor name. So if we add these in these brackets, this is the value that we can directly enter into this parameter. So that's what we want to use. Let's quickly save that so we can use that parameter name also in the code. And like this, we just also have a quick example of what we can do to also modify the code a little bit. So we have here our request where we can also add an additional string. So for example, as mentioned, the visitor name. This is now an additional variable. And now instead of just using the name from the query, we can just use this from the visitor name that we enter directly into the URL. So we can replace the name, and then this is the name that will be used in this message. We can also adjust it, so we can say, hello dear visitor, and then the name should be used. Let's quickly save it. We can also test it again. We have the name now already in the query. So we could, for example, now enter the value Nikolai. We can again run it. And then we get again the response code, okay, and we receive the message, hello dear visitor, and then this has been executed. And now if we want to execute this directly, we can also get this function URL. This is the URL of the function. So if we copy this, let's paste this into a new browser tab. You can see this is the visitor name, and in here I can now directly enter any value. So for example, I'm entering again my name, and then this will be executed and I get the message with this value Nikolai. That's how the function works. Of course, you don't need to worry too much about this code. That's beyond the scope, of course, of this lecture. But now we also quickly want to delete this again so that there are no additional costs related to this function. Therefore, we just open that, we can copy the name, and we can say delete the resource group. I'm just pasting in the name, and then everything is deleted. So these are the Azure functions. Let's have a look at Logic Apps. The definition of the Logic Apps, note this is also a serverless feature. We can use that to schedule, automate, and orchestrate tasks, business processes, and workflows. That's the definition of Azure Logic Apps. So what does that mean? We can design different workflows in these Logic Apps, and we can do this in a graphical way. For example, there's a trigger. This is usually the start of a workflow. For example, some kind of data is modified in a database, and then based on this trigger, some task will be executed. For example, an email will be sent to a user, and there can be also different conditions and different responses. So we can even really create a somewhat complex workflow all in a graphical way. Another example would be that maybe a new file will be added to some storage. And then as a response to this, we just want to copy this file to another location. So Azure Logic Apps is used to design a business workflow, so different tasks will be executed based on some kind of trigger. We can have different conditions. So if, for example, the file has a specific type, then maybe transform this type, convert it to another type, and then execute this task, maybe copy the file. So we can design that in a designer in a graphical way. And a very common example of this is that an email will be sent in response to a trigger. So Azure Logic Apps used to create workflows in a graphical way. That's the theory, and now of course let's also quickly head over to the portal and have a look at an example of the Azure Logic Apps. Let's now have a look at the Logic Apps in the Azure portal. We want to of course start by searching for the service Logic Apps. We can go there, and in here of course there are no Logic Apps to display. We want to create a new Logic App. And here we can create, again in the beginning, just a new resource group. We can call it Resource Group Logic Apps. We can click on OK. And the name has to be again unique. So let's try Logic App HTTP, because we are going to create an HTTP request and a response. This will be part of our workflow. And of course, if you don't have this name available, feel free just to add any additional number afterwards. In our case, this is fine. And we have this check mark here. Now the next step will be publish. We can leave the workflow because we want to use the visual designer and design a workflow. Region we can leave at the default. The plan type we can use consumption. As it suggests, this is best for entry because then it will be the serverless service, because now we will only pay as much as our workflow runs. Again, the zone redundancy, we don't need to change anything. We can leave it as disabled. And afterwards, we can just go to review and create. And after a second, this should be validated. And we can just go ahead and create this Logic app. This should take maybe around a few seconds, and then this should be created. So after 1 or 2 seconds even, this is already created. We can go to this resource and then when we do this, we will be directly in the Logic App Designer. We have a quick introduction, and then we can start our workflow. We can either start with a completely blank workflow. In here we could now search just for example, let's search for some kind of request. We can search for request. And then we find, for example, HTTPS request. We could now go ahead and use that as a trigger. So we can use it, we can select it, and in here we can now go ahead, add, for example, another step. So for example, this could be any of these suggested. We can search for additional actions. For example, I want to search for response. So let's search for response. And there we would find also the HTTPS response. We could configure that like this. Let's just for now discard this again and have a look at the other templates that are existing. We can have a look at this just again by going to templates in the top menu. The changes we can discard, and we are back in the designer. In here we see that we have some templates. For example, we can use some template that is deleting old Azure blobs. And we already have some pre-configured triggers and some responses. What we wanted to do is the HTTP request and response. So we see that there's also some template already existing. So if we just select this one, we see we have already just some very small pre-built workflow available. So we want to use this template, and we see this is what we could have also just created manually, step by step, just by adding these steps. In our case, we will have an URL. And since we want to also modify this URL, we want to just quickly add a method, because this is just a post URL. And we want to change also the method to have it as a get URL. Like this, we can enter the URL in the browser and we can modify some of the parameters. And also we want to add an additional parameter, which should be a relative path. For example, we want to add also the name. So we add the relative path, which will just be introduced with this /. And then afterwards, our variable name could be, for example, just name, where we can then use that also in the response. We can enter that into the URL, and then this will be used also in the response. So let's go ahead with this. Let's also again enter it. So we have a name. And then also in the response, we can now use that. So if we now type into the body, for example, welcome, and then we want to use the name parameter, we have this already suggested in this box here. So we can just select it, and then we can say this is what should be returned in this response. So we can have it like this, and now we could just save that. After a second, this is saved, and now we have this get URL. This is exactly what we want. We can now copy this, paste it in here, and we see this is now a very long URL, but we should be able to find the name as this parameter. And now we can add something that we want to have as a value for this name. So for example, I'm saying my name is Nikolai. I enter this into the URL, and then if I execute this, I get this message as a response that I have configured. So this will be our HTTP response. So we can see that we can use these templates to design our workflows. We can just add additional steps. We can use different triggers and responses and perform different operations using this designer in a graphical way. That's how we can use the Azure Logic Apps. In the end, of course, let's not forget to also delete this resource group again. So I'm going to the resource groups, copying the name, delete the resource, paste in the name so we can delete the entire app. This was just a quick demonstration on the Azure Logic Apps. Hope it was helpful, and see you in the next lecture.